In 1966, a man called a hospital. He wasn't a doctor. He had no credentials. No one had ever heard of him. And within 2 minutes, 21 out of 22 nurses were ready to administer double the lethal dose of an unknown drug to a real, living patient. Nobody stopped them. This experiment was so disturbing that psychologists sat on the results for years before publishing them, because they didn't want to believe it was real. 3 years before this happened, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram had already shaken the world. His experiments proved that ordinary Americans, school teachers, factory workers, people with no history of violence, would administer what they believed were fatal electric shocks to a stranger, just because a man in a white coat told them to. 65% compliance. The world was horrified. But Milgram's critics had one objection. It was a lab. It was artificial. Would the same psychology appear in the real world? In a high-stakes professional environment? Among people specifically trained to protect human life? Charles K. Hofling was about to find out. He chose hospitals. He chose nurses. People with years of training. People who understood medications, dosages, and what happens when those two things go wrong. Before running a single trial, Hofling did something important. He found a separate group of nurses, people who hadn't been in the study, and described the exact scenario he was about to test. He asked them directly, "What would you do?" 21 out of 22 said they would refuse. They gave the reasons without hesitation. The dose is too high. The drug isn't approved for the ward. Phone orders aren't authorized. Any competent nurse would push back. They were certain. They were wrong. Here's exactly what happened when the phone rang. A researcher called a real hospital ward. He identified himself as Dr. Smith, a name from the hospital's psychiatry department. A doctor none of the nurses had ever met. A name that didn't appear on the ward's approved physician list. He asked the nurse to check the medication cabinet for a drug called Astraten. The drug was there. The research team had placed it there in advance. But Astraten wasn't real. It was a fictional medication, created for the study. The label was printed clearly, maximum daily dose, 10 milligrams. Dr. Smith requested 20 milligrams, double the stated maximum, and there was more. Printed on the label, impossible to miss. Caution, for experimental use only. To comply, the nurse would need to retrieve the drug herself. No supervisor approval, no written order, which was required by hospital policy before any medication could be administered. No verification of the caller's identity. No authorization from the pharmacy. No prior record of Dr. Smith ever treating this patient. This wasn't a gray area. Every rule said stop. Multiple rules. Simultaneously. Obviously. And still. 21 nurses walked toward the patient's room with the drug in hand. The number bears repeating. 21 nurses, 21 phone calls, 21 bottles of Astraten, 20 of them complied. They were intercepted by a researcher positioned outside the patient's room, before any drug was actually administered. But the decision had already been made. They had the medication. They were moving. One nurse refused, just one. Now recall the survey group, the nurses who were asked beforehand what they would do. 21 out of 22 said they'd refuse. Same profession, same training, same rules. Completely opposite outcome. What changed? The phone rang, a voice spoke, and a title was invoked. That was all it took. The nurses were interviewed after the study. What they said explains everything. Most didn't feel like they were making a choice. Not because anyone threatened them, because a doctor had spoken. And that, in their world, was the end of the conversation. Psychologists call this authority bias. When the brain receives a directive from a high-status source, it doesn't evaluate that directive the way it normally would. It shortcuts. It assumes the authority has already done the thinking. He must know something I don't. He wouldn't ask if it wasn't safe. My job is to execute, not to question. This isn't stupidity. In most situations, deferring to expertise is the correct call. The shortcut works until it doesn't. There's a second factor. The title, doctor, Just a word spoken by a stranger over a telephone activated automatic trust. No verification, no credentials checked, a sound. That's all it was, and it overrode years of professional training in seconds. The third factor is the one no one talks about: social pressure asymmetry. The nurses weren't afraid of being harmed. They were afraid of being embarrassing, of seeming difficult, of the doctor's frustration if they pushed back. Several nurses described the same internal calculation afterward. If I'm wrong and he's right, I look incompetent. If I refuse and delay treatment, that's on me. The cost of refusal, socially, professionally, felt heavier than the cost of compliance, even when compliance meant walking toward a patient with a potentially lethal dose of an untested drug. The math was completely inverted. They knew it later, when it was over, when it was safe to think clearly. This wasn't a historical footnote. It was a warning, one that kept being ignored. A 1995 study found that 1 in 10 hospital medication errors involved a nurse who believed the order was incorrect and followed it anyway. In 2000, the Institute of Medicine published "To Err is Human." It estimated that medical errors killed between 44,000 and 98,000 Americans every year. Obedience to authority was listed as a contributing cause. The hierarchy in medicine had changed on paper. In practice, the dynamic had barely shifted, and it doesn't stop at hospitals. The same psychology activates in every structure where authority and hierarchy exist. When a manager instructs an employee to cut a corner on safety, when a superior gives an order that doesn't add up, when the voice on the other end sounds confident and waiting feels like the dangerous option. The uniform changes, the result often doesn't. Milgram proved that ordinary people harm strangers under authority pressure. Hofling proved that trained professionals, people whose entire purpose is to protect others, do the same thing. In a real hospital, with a real patient. On a normal Tuesday afternoon, the one nurse who refused was asked why. Her answer was short. She said she didn't recognize the doctor's name. It wasn't on any list she'd seen. That wasn't her problem to work around. She stopped. She followed the rule. She got it right. Not because she was smarter or braver, not because of different training, but because, for one moment, she didn't let the authority in someone's voice override the information in front of her eyes. That's the part that stays with you. It wasn't a special skill. It was just noticing. Hofling's experiment ended in 1966. The question it raised never did. If the phone rang right now, and the voice on the other end sounded completely certain, would you stop to check the label? Or would you already be walking to the room?